knows? Writers have no money.
That's what I've actually done.
Yeah, I have dinosaurs instead.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to
That
say,
costs $10.
I was very quietly sort of sitting there thinking, wow.
Yeah, no, an author friend of mine, Jonathan Howard, and I visited his old school when I was in England last year. And he, I guess, went into the library to see if it looked the way it looked when he was a kid. And I guess it's been upgraded. The kids are fancier now.
Yeah, Derek, it looks really hot where you are.
Well, it is Canada.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't resist that.
Second coldest capital in the world.
That's a cool background. Mine's
yeah,
actually
we had
by an IKEA.
What was that, Tim?
My background's actually wallpaper you can buy at IKEA.
Really?
No, they're real
amazing.
books. They're real books. I've only read about 4 of them though.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to be super impressed because it looks so like non-uniform, right?
Oh, it's not tidied up, and I've got my.
It even catches shadow and perspective. Oh, you've got one of those as well.
Facehugger, yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to have to brandish mine too.
And I'll hold up my alien toy on my desk.
Oh yeah, there we go. I've also got an alien made out of bolts and screws, which is pretty cool.
Nice.
Oh.
Yeah. I think Cheryl, keep the koala away because this vicious stuff out here.
It's not a koala, it's
otter.
a sea otter.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Local
Yes.
wildlife in California.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm known in this household for basically I'm very simple when it comes to biology. There are plants and there are animals and there's the other stuff. And I got animal.
I'll be in
Wait a minute, my
Australia
xenomorph has
tomorrow,
escaped.
okay? You can have koalas tomorrow.
Sea otters disguised as koalas. Oh, there's a possibility there. I hear koalas have been having a hard time after the fires. So maybe an import of sea otters would kind of, masquerading as koalas would change the balance a little.
I think for those people not fauna challenged, they would not mask each other. Rather different animals, I would say.
I am profoundly fauna challenged, my wife was going through the stuff in the garden. I've been digging stuff up. She said, "So do you know what that is?" And I said, "It's a plant." So can you be more specific? It's a green one. It's just that. Do you know if it's edible? I'd give a shot, which I don't think was the answer.
I'm impressed that you your fauna challenge is that you name all the flora you can't name.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, sorry, as I said, flora and fauna. That's it. I've got it broken down to. And Corey, I just identified fauna in your background. I'm going to take a while. That was.
But this can now be a
feline.
topic in the panel. The animal kingdom, the plant kingdom.
Yeah, and
What is
somehow
what?
if we can just have one of those scuttling in, it's discreet.
Anyway, we have Paddy now, who has
Hello,
sloped in
hi.
during the koala conversation. So
Oh, it was koalas. Oh, okay, right. I was trying to decipher. Hello, everyone.
Yeah, it all started from a non-koala and my misclassification. There are plants and there are animals, and I kind of group all the animals together and the plants together.
And maybe can't tell even those apart.
Keeps it simple.
You can always tell plants because
days.
they have cell walls.
To get close, though.
Normally, I don't walk around with a microscope.
Right.
It's one of those moments. Alien life form lands. I'm sitting there going, "They're an interest. I wonder if they're plants or animals." Quick, let me either run or get my microscope. It's.
Kevin, I mean, you've got quite a bad lag going on.
Yeah,
I have. Yes, I will go. Let me go and speak to my wife in that case, because I think we might have to switch the streams.
Okay. Oh, don't cross the streams.
Don't cross the stream.
Mine first. So I think we are still due a fair few attendees, but once Kevlin's back, I think we'll probably get started. So there are people still filtering in. The other thing I might suggest is that he logs out and logs back in again. I've had that solve that problem a couple of times previously.
So Derek, are you changing your backgrounds or have you a rolling background app? So I'm quite jealous.
as soon as I discovered that there were backgrounds, I started downloading different things that I could keep in a
Right.
directory. And recently Star Wars, I guess, released a whole bunch of backgrounds, and I went through and collected about 15 of those too.
Specifically,
Don't
you seen the
recognize the
ones
Star
from
Wars
the-
movie, Derek.
Have you
I
seen the
don't
ones from the
recognise-
BBC?
That's C3PO, obviously.
Of course it
Yeah,
is.
BBC one's great.
These are the early
budget version.
Macquarie. These are the
And that
early
might be a
Macquarie
koala.
drawings.
C3PO,
koala.
Chewbacca. I don't know who the other two are.
Han
That's
Solo and
Princess
Princess Leia.
I saw that thing, Adrian, where the BBC had put loads of empty sets up for
Yeah.
free that you can download. They're like really high def, empty,
Yeah.
like Only Fools and Horses, and I
All the
think
way
Red-
back to like the 60s and 70s, isn't it?
Yeah, is Red
Steptoe
Dwarf?
Son.
Is Red Dwarf on there? I think the drawing from Red Dwarf's on there.
Oh, maybe, yeah, yeah.
Okay, shall we start?
We do something foolish in the
Oh,
beginning.
no.
Scary killer clowns up. Try not to look at those now. So welcome everybody. Welcome to our new panelists, and welcome back to the panelists who are returning for this event. Welcome to the attendees who are joining us for the first time, and those who've been with us from the start, of which there are a fair few, I think. We really enjoyed the previous events. I'm sure we're all going to enjoy this one just as much. I think I'm going to hand over to Kevlin in a minute, who'll explain the panel setup, but we're having a switcheroo in the middle of the panel so that everybody gets a chance to talk. We've got the chat window running, so if you would like to ask questions from the audience, please do that on a sort of rolling basis. Don't save them to the end, because I think we are going to try and keep an eye on the chat panel. Kevin will try and keep an eye. I'll field questions to him as well. I'm going to try and do a little bit of live tweeting while I'm not on my half of the panel. But do feel free to flag anything up on Twitter that you think is particularly interesting. I'll try and save, well, I am saving the chat window, so I'll try and circulate it like I did last time, because I think last time there were a lot of links and people asking, oh, what was that book we were just talking about? So do use the chat window. It was really useful last time. And I'll hand over to Kevlin, and I hope everybody enjoys it.
Right. Okay. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and whatever, wherever you are. So the way we've got this structured is we have some excellent panelists, some new faces, some old faces, and we are going to divide the panel into two. We've been experimenting with formats, and this time, basically for about each half the panel will last about 40 minutes. Which gives us a little bit of time for explicit Q&A towards the end of each segment. And then we'll take a little break because to the best of my knowledge, all those who are on the panel and all of you out there watching are biological entities, and you may need to deal with biology at some point. So we'll take a midpoint break. I know I will be needing to deal with it. This is some good coffee. Well, it's adequate coffee. So we'll take a little break and have a little switch around. And today, these are all the panelists, and what Anne is going to do is by the, so you get to see everybody at the beginning. What Anne is going to do by the power invested in Zoom and her is going to tune out the people we will see in the second half. So we're going to, let me think, who we're going to tune out. We're going to dematerialize Gareth and Cheryl and Derek and Adrian, and Anne may remain in a disembodied form as she's kind of running the whole thing, but which leaves us with another Adrian. We've made sure we only have one Adrian in each half. Tim, Primi, Corey, and Paddy. So when we have dematerialized or evaporated or...
Sorry, who else am I
raised-
dematerializing?
Oh, and for free with Corey, we get an alien life form. Who
Maybe
else?
just a tail.
let me think. So yeah, we're keeping... Who are we getting rid of? Yeah, we're getting is that everyone?
It's like some kind of game show.
It is kind of game show. I think we're getting rid of Derek. Bye. Derek's on Mars anyway, so that's good. So he'll be back. So yeah, right, excellent. So
And I banish myself. Hang on.
magic dematerialization. Well, anyway, Anne will deal with that, and in the meantime, what we're going to do is I want if each of the panelists could introduce who they are and indeed where they are. We love finding out about people's time zones and local weather. I know that you're never supposed to start a story with the weather, but this is not a story. This is a panel. So That's always interesting. I will do it in the order that I'm seeing people on the Zoom screen, but also there's an interesting question about what theme to explore today. And there's the effect. We talk about science fiction, and science fiction, some people view science fiction as an exploration of the possible. Other people look at science fiction, it's not necessarily a contradiction, as a sort of fiction of a possible future. And into that, people often mix actually what I'm doing is I'm telling a story of the present, but what I'm doing is I'm turning the dials up to 10, or I'm moving something to a different context where that has become much more exaggerated or played out. And indeed, in some parts of the world and some parts of history, people have used science fiction as a way of telling a political story in an environment where they've not been able to. So all of these things may be true. I'm not sure we don't want to discuss the nature of it, but there is certainly the question of the effect of how the pandemic is playing out on, I guess, two aspects. One is on you as writers. There is a day-to-day personal experience, and some people have found it easy to cope with. Many people have found it surprisingly difficult, surprisingly only from a certain point of view. How is it affecting you? But there's also another aspect, is how is it going to affect the fiction, the nature of the fiction that we write, and the nature of the fiction that people want to read. We're in discussion before the preparation of the panel. There was a certain interesting discussion about optimism versus pessimism, that people in many parts of the world, in many countries, are actually experiencing greater social cohesion than is given to us by many of the more apocalyptic novels that we've come to expect. That actually a better side of human nature is coming out rather than a darker one. So if you could briefly explore in your intro, just say something about that, and then we'll use that as our springboard. I'm going to start with Corrie, as you are first on my screen.
All right. Hi, I'm Corrie L. Lee, and I am my first fantasy novel, Weave the Lightning, came out right during the pandemic in April from Solaris. So that's been interesting. Didn't cope with that as well as I expected to, because I was all excited to do my in-person first events. Let's see, I am in Seattle, Washington, and it is raining, as it is usually raining in Seattle. Very on brand. A little bit more about me. I also have a PhD in quantum physics from Harvard, and I've worked in the tech industry doing kind of online experimentation stuff to make it easier for people to find the things they want. Maybe I'll let the next person intro, and then
in which
into
case,
panel stuff.
so you are, it turns out that you're on my right. On my left is Adrian.
Oh, I'm Adrian Tchaikovsky. I'm probably best known for writing science fiction about spiders. Most recently, I have this out, which is horribly glary on my screen, unfortunately, Firewalkers. This is a novel about everything going horribly wrong, and it kind of epitomizes my take on it, in that I tend to write stories which are tremendously cynical about human nature and the sort of decisions humans make, but are nonetheless kind of turn out optimistically for a given value of optimism and which species you might happen to be rooting for.
For a given value of optimism, that deserves exploration. Tim.
Right, hi, I'm Tim Leben. I'm probably more known as a horror writer. Like Corrie, this is my new novel, Eden, which was launched on April the 7th. So it's my 45th novel, I believe. I've sort of lost count a little bit. And like Corrie, having a book launched during a global pandemic has been a very interesting experience. I was due to do my first actual physical book tour around the UK, and that obviously hasn't happened. There's been lots of effects on the book release, on scheduling, on supply, like Amazon being very quirky at the moment with book supplies. But I put it in perspective. I say to my wife, sometimes I'm feeling so pissed off that I had what I was hoping was going to be quite a big book for me released during the pandemic. And then I put it in perspective and say, it's a global pandemic. It doesn't matter whether my book sells X number of copies or not. It really doesn't matter that much. But you know, allied to that, small things do matter in a pandemic, and personal things do matter to keep you level and sane. I'm in sunny South Wales in the UK. It's actually sunny today. You've got us on one of our 3 days of the year where, it's nice. It's lovely.
Which bit of South Wales, Tim? Because I'm in Bristol, so just across the water, and
I'm close to Abergavenny.
Okay, so a little bit further out, because the weather here has been ridiculously good, but you've obviously had more rain in the past year.
It's nice. I mean, here we are talking about the weather. So, I mean, probably just to say, a lot of people watching this may not know me because I'm not necessarily known as a sci-fi writer. I've written thrillers and horror and fantasy. Eden is probably more sci-fi than anything I've written, other than, and I wrote a novella called Rime, which was Rime of the Ancient Mariner in Space. I know Adrian read it. Thanks, Adrian. And so people may not know me.
That's fine. We're not going to stand on genre boundaries. To the best of my knowledge, genre boundaries are not policed. We're certainly not doing that.
Good. I'm happy to hear.
Open borders on that. In fact, indeed, the last Wi-Fi Sci-Fi 2, we invited in a bunch of crime writers, and indeed a couple of the people under the SF guys were also crime writers in another way. So definitely open on that one. Preemie.
Hi, I'm Preemie. I write sci-fi, fantasy, horror, or whatever this is. It's been shelved in about 30 different genres, and it got rejected by a bunch of publishers because of that. And actually hearing Corey introduce herself, I just realized you're actually not allowed to read the book because it does extremely extrapolative things with physics that will cause an actual physicist to hoik it across the room. So don't ever read it. Please don't read it. Oh God.
Wait a minute, she's a quantum physicist, so maybe she will throw it across the room, maybe she won't.
I am so sorry. And
maybe you already did.
How fast it's going, but we won't know both. My day job is actually, it's 9 in the morning here. It's very sunny. I'm in Edmonton, Alberta. This is actually my second panel of the day. I'm very tired. Trying to do my best. And I'm looking forward to this panel. I work in government. That's my day job. I'm a government scientist. I work in environmental policy. These are interesting times, as well as you mentioned, interesting times to have your debut novel come out in March during a pandemic. But in terms of optimism and pessimism, I find myself kind of in two minds about things. There's a lot to be optimistic about on kind of the micro or regional level. I think we're seeing stories about communities pulling together, neighborhoods pulling together. Unfortunately, at the macro level, what we are seeing are systems crystallizing around their worst elements. And so working for government, what I'm seeing is people hoping that now is the perfect time to turn the battleship, come to a better system, a better way of doing things. But what we're actually seeing on the ground is that people are actually digging in more to entrench the bad systems, even while individuals and families and neighborhoods and cities are doing their best. It's kind of it's a very unfair situation, and I'm very conflicted about it. And I think someone should write a book about it.
Cool.
Not me.
Right.
Someone else.
So, Paddy, will you be that person?
Not straight away. I'm currently building a lot of things out of cardboard boxes. That's my job. For a toddler, or maybe not for a toddler, maybe for me, there's a bit of, but when I'm not building things out of cardboard boxes, I wrote a book, which also came out in March during the pandemic, which is, I didn't mirror my screen. It's called Echo Cycle, and it's
okay. We see it.
We saw it.
Do you see it the right way around? Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah,
okay, cool.
That's for your benefit. The
oh, is it? Okay, right. That's from Titan. Tim, you're with Titan, I think. Right?
Yeah.
So represent. So I was probably more pessimistic during the writing of the last book than I was previously, mainly because it was a lot about kind of like the things that have happened since 2016 politically, and the sort of sea change in mood towards populism and all that sort of stuff. Since the pandemic's hit, I've counterintuitively gone a little bit more optimistic. I don't know why. Maybe because I think in the UK, like Kevlin alluded to, we've started to see at least reports of social cohesion that perhaps we assumed had died and was no longer a thing, and had been thrown out, and we were so incredibly entrenched in one of two camps that there's no way that we would ever bridge the divide, and that seems to actually be kind of not manifesting itself in quite such a horrific form as we thought it did, maybe because we're all in such a great big global thing. So yeah, so that's my position on it. I guess I write pessimistic, but I'm thinking optimistic.
Okay, so that actually relates to, in one sense, an observation. Sarah Hillary, one of the crime writers on the previous Wi-Fi Sci-Fi, I've known her for a number of years, and one of the things that she loves pointing out is, don't worry about crime writers. They write about all the really dark stuff, but that they're actually quite nice people. They're letting it all out. It's the romance writers you've got to watch out for, because they're clearly not letting something out. So in that sense, you write pessimistic, but you feel optimistic. Okay, and I'm the moderator, Kevlin Henney. I'm based in Bristol, as I said before. I am actually releasing a book, but it's not a fiction book. I'm releasing I'm in software development. So the book has been edited and finalized, co-authored with Trisha G, who's based in Spain. And that's coming out next month. And it has been slightly surreal because we had a whole load of other things we were going to do to help launch it. The only other thing I've managed to successfully do is produce an adult 18 years ago who turned 18 under the pandemic. That's a terrible age if you're extroverted and 18. The 14-year-old introvert is absolutely loving this. So with that in mind, let's pick up a couple of those thoughts there. And I think I'm going to pick up on the mix that Primi actually highlighted. You highlighted the micro versus the macro, and I think that the real world is always more complex. We'd love to be either I think people like a simple, at one level, they want a simple tale of optimism or a simple tale of pessimism. But the real world is much more muddled, which I guess creates texture in a story if we can get it there. And I think we kind of react against stories that are a little bit too directed in one or other. It's all pessimistic, it's all optimistic, and the real world doesn't fit neatly into that. It's not necessarily down the middle. It's at different levels, different points of view. It has a bit of both. And I'm interested in anybody's thoughts on how you feel that this is going to feed into the fiction that people will want to read, or the fiction you might be inclined to write. I'm not necessarily saying you're going to go out and write pandemic fiction, but it's difficult to go through this experience and not come out with observations of people and that influence it. Perhaps there are genuine pandemic inspired strains that will find their way into your stories, but perhaps there are other aspects that perhaps you wouldn't have considered before.
I'll go. I think one of the things that we're going to see is a lot less of this sort of like lone wolf ideal. You don't see it maybe necessarily as much in science fiction and fantasy, though it's there as well, of the brilliant lone wolf scientist or investigator or whatever that doesn't need people. And I think this experience where we're all sort of locked inside and locked off from people is maybe going to help people realize that that's maybe not such an ideal to aspire to, or like really very even realistic for anyone but some very extreme personalities. And I think we're going to start seeing more of this importance of social connection and friendships and that sort of thing showing up in fiction.
There's certainly a very common kind of archetype in post-apocalypse stories, the sort of Walking Dead setup where you have your community, and it's very much the members of that community, and then outside there are the zombies or the wolves or the whatever the hell is the actual problem. And it is that kind of survivalist dream. Well, yes, we can survive the apocalypse. We get our little crew of people together, and then we will be the new future, and everyone else will be the zombies or whatever. And I mean, in a way, that's almost the big lie, I think, that's turning up, because what we're seeing now, we're seeing a situation where everyone is kind of being required to be on their own, and yet we are seeing a great deal of outreach and a great deal certainly from a grassroots level up, a great deal of sort of personal heroism and people giving a great deal, giving what they can give, doing what they can do. And we're seeing how it's not, it's not the great man theory of history, as it were, as to what is carrying it through. It is the fact that a large number of people right at the bottom are risking their lives and doing everything they can to keep all those wheels turning, without which a big man at the top waving a flag will achieve literally nothing.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you look into the people that are running some of the biggest countries in the world, it seems to be heavily influenced by kind of Randism and sort of the soloist principle of, just work bloody hard, but don't help anyone else along the way. And it's a theory that I think is appealed to a lot of the people that are currently running things. But nothing else has smashed that theory in the crotch quite so effectively as having to deal with what we're dealing with. And I think that's going to be reflected, like all things in the art that comes out of it, in books, and perhaps like a little bit less, like Corey said, a bit less of the I'm just going to go it alone because I'm awesome, and it's going to be a lot more of a kind of like, well, maybe we're greater than the sum of our parts.
I'm wondering if there'll be like a polarized take on it as well. I mean, when the first few weeks of the pandemic, there was lots of talk about, I'm never picking up a pandemic horror novel again, or there's no way I'm going to be able to write about this. And then on the other side, loads of people I know started reading The Stand again by Stephen King, because they said, oh, now's the time to reread The Stand. And that's probably because you've got 8 weeks when you're doing nothing else, because you need that long to read that book. So I'm wondering, so at present, I think the reaction to it amongst readers is fairly polarized. It's like, yes, I'm happy to read pandemic fiction. My wife watched Contagion, the movie again, which is almost a documentary. It's so terrifying. But moving on from this, I think the one thing in the discussion email we had, somebody said there'll be more. It might be new, Paddy. Might be more utopian fiction coming out as opposed to dystopian. I've destroyed the world many times in my fiction, I must admit. But I've always, and I think, like Paddy said, my fiction can be viewed as quite pessimistic because the world goes to crap and people start doing this and that and nasty stuff happens. But there's always a real rich vein of optimism. I'm an optimist by heart, even now. Although there was a day last week where there was some bad news, as ever, about the pandemic, and then another headline saying babies killed in gunman raid on a maternity unit. So I turned the news off. That was somewhere I think it was in Afghanistan. So that was one day where my optimism took a real hit. But it hasn't surprised me the way people have reacted. And I'm pleased that I haven't been surprised. I'm pleased that people have stepped up. Those first few Thursdays clapping out the front door, I got quite emotional. It's become a routine part of the week now, but I'm generally got a positive view of people, and I hope people don't have a short memory. When we talk about how governments are going to move on from this, Primi, I hope people don't have a short memory and don't forget what it was like.
Is it very different in the States though, Primi, like and over there, because the reports that you see are of a lot more kind of like really active resistance to a lot of the kind of like good advice that we're being told to follow, as opposed to here where maybe it's a bit more gentle.
I'm actually in Canada, so on a federal level, it probably looks a lot better, I think. But in the specific province that I'm in, we're sort of the Texas of Canada, and there's a lot of people with that same sort of not actually like some of the positive aspects of it either, but like that sort of nasty, possessive, manifest destiny, frontier spirit. You can't tell me what to do. I work in land management, fight with people over public versus private land all the time. This general idea that the government absolutely cannot tell you what to do. And actually, when Tim brought up The Stand, that was the first thing I thought of, was that in The Stand, they immediately form communities, kind of like Corey was saying. So there's survivors, they pull together, they don't stay separate, they do go form the two separate communities. They get the lights back on. They get, water. That's the first thing that Vegas prioritizes, is getting the lights back on and coming back to some semblance of normality. And they don't think they're the evil ones. They don't think they're the bad guys. They're very preoccupied with their survival at the expense of whatever other communities' survivals. And I think about that a lot, that they did form these very similar communities with families and children and trying to rebuild their lives. And it's very clear that one is the bad side and one is the good side, and neither of them sees themselves as the bad side. And because I think King did that so well and so specifically, I think I was expecting to see a lot of it in dystopian fiction afterwards. And I think that's kind of the only place I've really seen it set up like that, like two virtually identical communities, except one super duper evil. But yeah, in terms of, sorry, I'm rambling, but just in terms of pandemic fiction, right now, I would rather be waterboarded with a bathtub full of bees than read anything about this stupid pandemic in fiction. If I open up something and it mentions that someone's got the sniffles, I'm closing it again. I cannot cope anymore. Give me a couple of years.
I think so that, sorry, Corey.
I was just going to say, I think it's interesting too. I've heard people, excuse me, talking about wanting fiction that is not reminding them of the open world, of when we could go out and give our friends hugs and all of that stuff, and like looking for fiction that is a little more isolated, girl with her dog alone in the wilderness kind of thing. And I think that's something that I find will be kind of interesting to see how that evolves as the world kind of slowly reopens, and what that means. Are we going to be kind of triggered by seeing stories that are written from before, where people are just like going out to big sporting events or concerts or whatever, and be like, oh God, this feels so unsafe, which is kind of how I feel right now when I read those sorts of things. Or is that going to feel hopeful? I think that'll be interesting to see.
I think there's a couple of questions that I think are interesting on this point of view. We've been talking about the social cohesion, and Shel Bryson mentions transit. Is the social cohesion we're seeing, is it transitory? Is it a temporary affair? What comes next? Will we go back to normal, or the previous normal? Will we find that normal is gone? Jeff Park also makes an observation. There are stories about optimistic futures and apocalyptic futures. Do we think there's a potential genre about society and civilization building up after the fall? In other words, very specifically fiction focused on that. So displacing away from the current pandemic. But as we saw with the kind of the YA dystopian period a few years ago, and explored in a previous panel, does this mean we're just going to end up with utopias? Probably not. But are we going to see Are we going to see stories of change that specifically start from a particular point of view, whether it is the fall of civilization or if it's something more obviously related to our current experience, and a reconstruction fiction, for want of a better term? Is this likely to be something there'll be an appetite for, but also an inspiration for?
Well, there's at least a market for it, because that's the book that I just sold to ECW. It's basically the rebuilding part of things. So it's the story, big system, small story. So a girl who has to choose between leaving to study, like leaving her community to study, or staying to help rebuild, because it's implied that all the major disasters and problems that have happened have been fairly recent. So people are still kind of in that recovery stage. And I, for one, would like to see more of that. Not how do you start from scratch, but how do you start from something broken and try to make something better of it on an upward trajectory given limited resources. I would really like to see that, with the understanding that you're never going to have a utopia, because every utopia is a dystopia for some population within it.
Yeah. Be careful what you wish for. And actually bridging that to an earlier observation about this idea, and again, Tim mentioned contagion, and we started off by sort of observing that this idea of the lone wolf, that kind of heroic figure, this growth in stories are told from multiple points of view. In other words, to let us paint the world, and we can see actually that's cinematically done in Contagion, but we see it a lot in books. There's kind of a sense that that kind of framework is actually quite a good one to tell the stories you're describing through. So there is this idea that we've seen within fiction shifts. For these days, we are more comfortable with the idea of fragmented novels than people would have been a couple of decades ago, and multiple points of view. I remember reading, I don't know, was it Friday by Robert Heinlein when I was a kid? That was the first book I'd read where there were multiple points of view, one for each chapter, told in the first person. That's not to say it hadn't been done before, but for me, that was a real shift. I can't say much positive about the rest of the book, but it was just like, oh, this is a different way to tell the story. And that idea of creating that bigger picture through this very personal idea, which I think relates to another question I've just seen from Andy Lewis. With the reactions of people in your local area and nationally and their behavior, what influence has the pandemic had on your character creation? I think that's quite an interesting one. And you may not have thought about this, but if you were reflecting on it, do you think you would be looking for something else, or perhaps dig a little deeper into certain aspects?
I think it might take a while to bleed through to our fiction. I mean, I don't know about you all. I'm in the depths of a current novel, and I don't think what's happening at the moment is actually feeding into that novel. But it's definitely, my subconscious is going to be stirring all this around and coming up with something that for the next project or the next project. And I think, I mean, it's been a sudden thing, the pandemic and the lockdown in some respects. But I also heard somebody refer to it after the first couple of weeks as a slow motion 9/11. 9/11 changed the world in an instant. The pandemic's going to change the world, has changed the world, and will continue to change the world over the space of months or quite possibly years, I think. So I think something like 9/11 probably actually physically changed people's psyche. It was so sudden and so horrific and so mind-bending. This is bending your mind slower, and there is
a melting potness. Yeah, there's a melting pot as an author, but I think exactly what you're describing, because I have it with my kids, and the 9/11 aspect with them. In fact, my younger one is due to start. That's in their history class, and that's coming up in a few weeks. But we watched. It was a really interesting one. We watched. What was it last night? We watched Kill Bill. And there's a point where Uma Thurman's character takes a katana on a plane. Says, "Dad, can you take swords on planes?" I said, "Well, probably not." But I said, "But back then, when the film was made, it wouldn't have surprised me if you got away with it, because things were very, very lax." My kids are utterly shocked when they see representations of airports from the 20th century, how casual and insecure they are, and how all of this kind of stuff. And it's from that point of view, I think you're right. This one's going to be a slow motion thing, and many of the consequences, both personally but also more broadly, I think will be more obviously felt in time to come.
I mean, I think one of the things I would look to see in characters, and certainly I suspect the way it'll feed into my future writing, is representations of extreme selfishness and extreme altruism, because I think that to a certain extent, extremely altruistic characters certainly in fantasy fiction have been out of favor for a while, and I would look for that sort of thing to be coming back, especially in that kind of community support level of people giving their all for their group. But also, on the other end of the scale, we've seen some incredible profiteering, and we've seen some astonishingly exploitative behaviors from people who are in a position to do it. And it's one of those, you think, well, if I was writing a villain a little while ago with that kind of motivation, it would be kicked back by the editor as being too shallow. And now he's saying, well, actually, no, this is a thing. People will, that the kind of the moment in Aliens where the corporate stooge just abandons someone. I'm trying to desperately not to spoil a very old film here, but just abandon someone to the alien because that's their instructions, despite the fact it's probably going to get them killed too. That actually apparently happens. People are that selfish and that dumb, and are doing it in a massive scale on a public stage. And that's something I think we probably do want to explore as well as the good, because we don't want to, in a sense, maybe we have a responsibility to record and remind people of that sort of thing as writers.
Well, and I think back to Premi's point on the previous question, like seeing kind of in the reconstruction phase, and whether or not it takes place in reconstruction phase, this sort of dichotomy of the small group or grassroots desire to help and uplift people, and fighting against the existing entrenched power structures that are deepening and worsening already problematic elements of our society, right? I think that's going to be a big thing that we see. I think we're already starting to see it a little bit before the pandemic, of when getting some more marginalized voices on stage and being able to hear perspectives of, hey, the system's super not working. And I think, I'm hoping, my optimistic take at least, is that this pandemic is going to encourage us to bring those voices forward even more, as we say, hey, look, like things are broken in ways that maybe a lot of people were willing to overlook before, but hopefully we'll be less willing to overlook in the future.
I think it's, sorry, go on, Primi.
Sorry, no, I was just going to riff quickly off something what Adrian said. I absolutely agree. I think we are going to see more of that type of character in fiction, because it seems to be a lot of sort of individual level discrete decisions of one person thinking, I'm not a bad person, but I think I am going to profit off of this small micro level misery because I can, or because it'll help my family, or because it makes me happy, or because I can make $50. And what's happening though is that all that's happening, and I'm pointing to Corey, you can't see, all that is happening in a system that enables it to aggregate in a way that those individual decisions would not be that harmful. But now it's not just a single villain, not just a single bad guy, and not just a single nasty, opportunistic person, or even like a nice person just spotted an opportunity to be, a selfish bastard for 5 minutes. So the way the system is set up to favor those people, to clump them together, and to allow them to have a disproportionate effect on the rest of the population, I hope we can represent that in our books so that people can understand that that's exactly what's happening.
I think that's a very important point, because I think that historically, I think the way that fiction, we do less of it these days, but it's certainly the case, classic Bond baddie is clearly bad to the bone all the way through, genetically, everything about them, very few people ever identify themselves as being bad. They are always doing something that they regarded as good. Kids who end up in gangs, people in mafia, there's always a story there that is something that they are doing for their family, or something that is about the art of possibility. And so I think this goes back to this idea that humans are a little bit messier, and that is something we can probably do better, represent more cleanly in fiction, because I get turned off by stories of bad people being obviously bad, and it's just like, actually the world is a little there you go, now there you go, all the cue, but I know you're not bad because you're not wearing a black hat or whatever it is. So I know how to read these things. Right, so we're going to close the first half, and although there's a wonderful question from Jeff Park here, I think that's a little more directed at Corey and Primi, and it's in the sort of Q&A box. Perhaps that's something that can be explored in the breakout sessions. But I'm just going to ask everybody to kind of give a summing up thought about either where, in other words, not in the next 6 months, but where they think, what they think 4 or 5 years, either from a personal perspective about things they might feel, how will my fiction have changed, or how will the fiction landscape have changed What are the possible directions? I'm not asking you to predict. I'm asking you to sort of, here's a possibility. This might, I could see this one happening from where I'm standing and either looking at myself or looking at the industry. So I'll do that in reverse order. Paddy.
So I, jumping off what Tim said, I think that the conceit of novels being that you're reading what someone was thinking 5 years ago will play out in that they'll, like we've been saying, there'll be more grey area of character in the future, which is good because it's a representation of humanity as it stands. And I know that fiction, and particularly sort of science fiction, is very escapist, but I think we'll be craving less polarization when we're coming out of this. So if I had to predict anything, I'd be that there would be more messy characters. There'll still be an element of redemption because I think people like the idea of redemption, but I think that someone who doesn't have a clean slate will be very much de rigueur. Yeah.
Cool. Primi.
Yeah, I think what will end up happening in my fiction is that I will give in to my impulses to write more about people's worst natures. But I think what I'd like to see in sci-fi particularly is almost more kind of mechanistic or about craft, which is I would like to see books about the knock-on effects of disasters and things that we haven't thought about. Just as a very quick example, near when this all began, I had a friend who lives in California and has a side hustle cleaning shipping containers from China and reselling them. And he was like, well, last week there were 57. This week there are 3. What's going to happen to my business? And I thought, what about all the stuff that's in those containers? Like, what's happening to the supply lines? And he's like, what? I don't care. Okay, fair. But, when all this started, I don't think that's something I would have thought about happening. You just kind of take for granted that the various systems work. None of us know how all the systems fit together until they start to fall apart. So I think I'd like to see that appear in fiction.
Cool. Tim.
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I tend not to dig down too deeply into trying to decide where my stories come from, because I'm afraid they'll stop coming. People, that old "where'd you get your ideas from?" I hate that question because I don't know and I don't want to know.
So I won't use that in the wrap up at the end. Okay, fine.
Yeah, okay. Like I said, I'm a bit of, generally when it comes to people, I'm a bit of an optimist, and I just the last 2 or 3 years there's been a real push, and I think it's down to the pit of social media. There's been a real push for kindness. There's be kind, if ever there's a terrible celebrity suicide because they've been driven to suicide through people trolling them on Twitter and things like that. There's always this push. People wear T-shirts, be kind. It's all about being kind. And I like to think that there's going to be more optimistic stories written about this period than pessimistic, because I think it's probably different either side of the, not in Canada, Primi, but certainly in the US, the visions we're getting out of the US is people storming government buildings with AR-15s. That's not happening here. We've got a few protests here and there, but generally people are being decent and doing what they're told because they think it's the right thing to do. I am waffling now, but I think some more optimistic, upbeat fiction. Although I am a horror writer and I do love destroying the world, I'm not sure I'm going to be doing that for the next few years.
I don't think there is any contradiction in that at all.
No. Thank you.
Adrian.
Just very quickly building on what Premi was saying, I think fiction that has a more complicated victory condition, rather than yes, everything is fine now because we've killed the Dark Lord or because we've done this, or that there is any kind of switch where that suddenly you've achieved your thing and so the world is saved. The idea of that fixing things is a longer and more complicated task, and that you need and that it needs ongoing. It's not just yes, well, I have died nobly and therefore we have won. It's just like dying nobly doesn't work. Living for a thing rather than dying for a thing is far more important, and that it's harder to write, but to me that kind of makes it more interesting as a prospect. But it's also that's how the world works. The world doesn't work on suddenly Nelson being shot at the Battle of Trafalgar was not what won the Battle of Trafalgar. But that's the narrative that tends to be taught
Yeah.
because that's convenient and it's pleasing, but it's not true.
Cool.
Um,
Corey, you get the last word.
Ooh. I think we'll see a lot more hopeful narratives. Of course, that's what I write, so that's what I like to read. But I think there's a lot of space for people, not a utopia, but people working together, people being good people, like Tim was saying, and trying to fix things that are broken and fighting against systems and just that idea that we can make a difference. I think that's going to be really important to people. I think that's always important to people, but I think it's going to be especially important to people to be able to think, this could be me. I could make an impact. The things that I could do could change things, because I think there's a lot of feeling of helplessness right now of, I'm stuck in my house or my apartment, and what can I do to help? And so I think ways that people can help, whether it's armed resistance or whether it is, delivering meals to the elderly, like there's going to be space for hopeful, kind people fighting the good fight.
That is a wonderfully optimistic way to end the first half. So thank you very much for the first wave of panelists, and we welcome Anne back to be in charge of things. And there's our single heroic figure, pulling all the strings, making things happen. So I think we're having a 5-minute break now.
Yes. So what I'll do is I will disappear the panelists from the first half and appear the panelists from the second half. But then, yes, we've got time to go off and have a quick break. Obviously, if you have your audio and video on, don't take your phone or whatever to the loo with you. I think we know that you didn't. Otherwise, we'll see you back here in 5 minutes.
Excellent. Right. See you in 5.
Hi. Okay, I only had to remember 4 people. How can I only remember 2 of them? Gareth. And no, that's it. Right, I think that's all of us for the second half. I'm just going to go and grab a drink, and I'll see you back here in a couple of minutes.
Derek?
Oh, Derek. Yes, Derek. Thank you, Cheryl.
Marie Bellido, I think. From.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Marie.
Well done, Marie.
I knew I was going to forget somebody. He's going to come on with like a really angry background.
Mars, you can't get more angry than that.
Right, I'm just going to go and get a drink quickly.
Hi, Derek.
How's it going?
Yeah, we're good.
How's your early morning writing going, Derek?
Zagreb.
I was editing today. I've been finding that I don't have the bandwidth to do drafting as sustainably, and so I'm turning to a novel that I knew I needed to edit to get it from draft 4 to draft 5, and I've been doing that a lot for the month of May, and it's I find that polishing is easier than drafting in the first place. So
yeah, I agree.
Yeah, but yeah, I was up at 7:20 and worked till 10:40 and then came over here.
Cool.
I'm
you find
meeting
the early
with
mornings are better to write at?
I've just gotten used to it. I mean, after having been a parent for a while, I was the parent that did the early morning stuff, and then also my work starts at 8. So writing from 6 till 8 or something is a little more natural, I think, for me now. But because we're all working from home, you know, I don't wanna, you know, you're in your house, there's so many distractions. And so I've been meeting with other writers by Zoom, and we just mute ourselves, but we're all on the screen. So if you leave, everybody knows. So that's quite helpful.
That's cool.
That's cool.
How about you guys? Are you writing differently right now?
Wish I had time to write. I'm much too busy.
Yeah.
I've just finished something. It's given me a bit of a boost somehow. I don't know why. But yeah, I had a really sort of slow year last year writing, but since January, it's just kind of picked up. Not sure what that is.
Well, I guess that's one of those things of don't ask too closely, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, it's interesting because I not so much on the fiction front. I think I tend to write short stories and flash fiction. That seems to have gone down a little bit, but my non-fiction writing has gone up, which I find interesting. I'm not sure why, but perhaps maybe I'm looking for some kind of security in the world of facts and things that can be factual, and I can say that this is true and that is not, and that is comfortable, and it is almost nothing to do with people and the complexity of the world. Maybe it's an escapism. You know, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but you know, it could always be that.
So what time are we going to restart the second half?
Whenever you're ready.
I think we can do that. We can do that now.
Sorry, I'm just replying.
Meg, if you're listening, stay here. The second link is for the
Yes.
Cafe Clutch thing.
The second link. I don't know why I just typed the answer when I could have actually just said it. You know, Cheryl was ahead of me on that one. Yes, the second link is for the breakout sessions, which is being run as a Zoom meeting, so we had to do it as a separate link. So the whole panel will run on this link. Just made myself a disgusting cup of tea again. I think that's the whole trying to do it too fast. I did this at the last event.
You can't rush good tea.
No, definitely not.
There was a big discussion about tea, I seem to remember.
Well, I think it was triggered off by me making a disgusting cup of tea, I think.
Well, you know, and everybody wants to help, you know, it's just like I have so many windows, I cannot find the one I'm looking for.
I'm using a new microphone. How am I sounding?
Very good, very smooth. So
Cool.
yeah. What have you got? Because I got myself a new microphone as well recently. So,
One of those, I can't remember what it's called. The
Yeah,
pseudo
tea is complicated in space. It all depends
In
on
North,
what temperature of water boils at.
I was thinking that, but I didn't want to look daft by saying it if I just entirely imagined it.
that's interesting.
Got a problem?
No. The problems of my own devising. There we go. That's cool. Right.
Just before we start the second half, I was trying to live tweet as much as possible in that first half. I don't know whether if anyone does want to do a little bit in the second half, they could. Feel free.
I like your Hamiltonian, Kevlin.
Yeah, you are welcome. I just suddenly thought, you know, it's the book is the book that is in a superposition of being thrown and not thrown. So yeah, we were talking about complexity. It's got complex numbers. Life is complex. Right. Okay. So yeah, I think we're probably good to go in that case.
Okay.
Right, so welcome back, everybody. And if you're not back, I'm speaking to the void. So welcome back, everybody, to the second half of the Wi-Fi Sci-Fi 3 panel. And so we have 5 more panelists. And I will again ask for introductions in the order that I see people on my Zoom screen. So I will start with Anne. So basically, introduce who you are, and anything about the optimism, pessimism spectrum, either from a personal perspective or how you see the industry and the reading and viewing world as a whole.
Well, I'm Anne Corlett. My first novel was out a couple of years ago, and as soon as we're doing the book cover thing, it's here. I have not mirrored my screen, I realise. It's called The Space Between the Stars. The optimism, pessimism thing, I woke up in the middle of the night, I don't always sleep terribly well, and had a whole load of very profound thoughts about the whole pandemic and my view on it. And I can't remember most of them. But I think the thing that I was mulling over is that it was either Mike Carey or Adrian who said something at a previous event about the scaffolding of human society being taken away in post-apocalyptic novels. And I think we discussed this a little bit last time, that during the pandemic, we've had some of that scaffolding taken away. And for me, a really interesting thing's been looking at what parts of that scaffolding were a positive thing in my life and in society generally, and what parts were actually quite negative or just not as strong as we thought they were. So in terms of kind of like personal relationships, there's some friendships that I've realized really weren't actually as strong as I thought they were. And there's others that I hadn't really given perhaps as much space to as I could have done, and have turned out actually to be rock solid. So for me, a lot of the optimism I think I might be exploring in the future in my writing would be around, yeah, around that, around the what has stood up, what stood the test of the pandemic, perhaps, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so in other words, it almost going to extend the metaphor, the infrastructure and scaffolding, what is scaffolding and what is actually load bearing?
Yes, that's exactly it.
Yeah. Brilliant. Adrian, fulfilling our quota of Adrians in the second half.
Yeah, I'm Adrian J. Walker. If you know me at all, it's probably from a book called The End of the World Running Club, which came out a few years back. That, as it sounds, is an apocalyptic book. So a lot of my writing has been in the post-apocalyptic social collapse kind of domain. But my writing has changed a little bit in the last couple of years. Not just because of the pandemic, but I've kind of moved out of that field a little bit, and I'm thinking more about intelligence and how we behave in certain societies. I've got a book out, or I had a book out in April called The Human Sun. Difficult to push the optimism of this book because there are no humans in it. They're all dead, but it is a hopeful book. And I am writing a lot more about hopeful things. I think with regards to the optimism, pessimism thing, I'm definitely on the side of the optimism. What I think is very interesting, reflecting on what Anne just said, is that before this time, I think we've been very, there's been a kind of quiet fatalism, I think, about how we behave in society and how society affects us. We're kind of at the behest of this huge machine, you know, that directs everything. But in this last few months, I think we've seen that maybe we're not quite so embroiled in it after all. You know, we can operate in small communities, we can kind of operate locally. And I think if there's anything that I could see happening to my fiction or speculative fiction as a whole, it's the idea that maybe we are going to operate on a smaller level, and maybe there'll be more stories about that.
Cool. Cheryl.
Hey, that would be me. I'm more of a publisher than a writer, so I run Wizard's Tower Press. This is our latest book. It's contemporary fantasy about a woman who has a shape-shifting dragon as a boyfriend. Not as convenient as you might think. And then, of course, we publish Juliet McKenna. This one is up for the Best Novel Award in the British Science Fiction Awards tomorrow night. I would like it to win, but I'm sure that Gareth and other Adrian will have something to say about that. And they have wonderful books as well, not to mention Emma Newman and Terry Thompson. During the lockdown period, Wizards Tower Press is providing one free short story a week for people to read. I'll put a link through to where you can get that. And I'm calling in from virtual California because at the moment I'm doing a charity fundraiser for a charity in Bristol called 125, which supports street sex workers. So these are people who really have no choice but to to go out and try and earn money any way they can, and trying to get as much money to support them as possible. And basically what I'm doing is it's Give It Up fundraiser, and I'm giving up living in the UK. I'm spending 6 days traveling around the world virtually and talking about my travels and places I visit and all that sort of stuff. And I will post a link to that as well.
Excellent. And the weather in California is?
Weather is warm and sunny. And I'm communing with the local wildlife. This lovely little sea otter here. It's fabulous. On the optimism, pessimism thing, I try hard to remember that anecdotes are not data. And I think it's very tempting to go from what you're feeling about the whole pandemic thing and assume that the rest of the world will be the same. And personally, I'm loving lockdown. I've got so much stuff to do, and I don't have to worry about all those other people out there, which is, yeah, it's nice. I mean, I'm perfectly happy doing Zoom meetings, but I'm also perfectly happy not having to spend loads of time on trains and all that sort of thing. I think what we can do is look at the state of the world. And, on the one hand, Primi and Derek in Canada, I think, are still living in a approximately functioning democracy. I don't think that Corey in the US or us in the UK are still doing that. We have an extreme right-wing government here with a majority of 80 that was elected on a manifesto that said that if anybody tried to oppose what they wanted to do, they would change the law to make it impossible. And they still have another 4.5 years of their government to run before they even have to face an election. And one of the things that they've promised to do is to take away all my civil rights. So the longer the pandemic goes on, the longer I still have civil rights for. Once it's over, they're going to get back to their program, and I have to start thinking about fleeing the country again.
Right. Gareth. Gareth?
So, yeah, hello. Sorry, for some reason I muted the volume. I thought you were all being a bit quiet. Yeah, hi, I'm Gareth Powell, the author of science fiction books about monkeys and spaceships. My book, Fleet of Knives, is up on the shortlist for the BSFA award tomorrow. And my most recent one, Light of Impossible Stars, is out now and only £1.59 on Amazon this week. So, just in case you're interested. I am usually a full-time writer, stay-at-home father. So for me, it's not been a huge upheaval. I mean, my day is still, spent at this desk here. The only really noticeable changes are that my daughter isn't at school, and going out to do the weekly shopping feels like stepping into a J.G. Ballard novel. From that point of view, everything seems to still be functioning, but I went out yesterday and I was the only one of a very small number of people who were actually wearing a mask, which I found quite worrying, because our media is agitating to open up schools and open up business, when our death toll is still quite high and still steady. So from that point of view, I think what I'm going to take away from this, and what may be becoming more obvious in my fiction, is more of a profound distrust of the motives of people in government and in power.
Okay. And Derek.
Yeah, I'm in Ottawa right now, and I'm a Solaris Rebellion author, and I have the Quantum Magician and Quantum Garden out. And I've been adapting to the pandemic like everybody else in different ways. I mean, I normally have a management office job, and so now I'm managing 12 or 15 people by Zoom, which is, well, not Zoom. I mean, there are many kinds, but that's very different. And at the same time, though, I think that I agree that Canada has largely managed this responsibly, so I don't feel like my government is against me. and that's good. But I mean, I do have to say that, you know, I have just the normal con circuit that we have, right? I would go to a lot of American cons, and so I have a lot of American writer friends, and, you know, friends by Facebook, friends by Twitter, and so on. And it's heartbreaking to sort of see the sort of things that they're facing, and some of the utter irrationality that some parts of society are using to approach this. In terms of the optimistic, pessimistic side, though, I'm generally an optimistic person. As far as my writing goes, I already start from the viewpoint that I want to be as far away from Earth as possible. And so I'm already a sense of wonder junkie, and I'm already an escapist sort of writer as well. So I think my natural inclinations there are just to go a tiny bit further than I'm already going. And so, you know, my space opera and epic fantasy stuff that I'm writing is just further and further away. And when we, you know, when we get to the question of, you know, how is this going to affect our fiction or other people's fictions, I'll have a few thoughts, but I mean, I'll just leave that there for now for introductions.
Okay, cool, brilliant. So there are a couple of thoughts that came out of the first kind of the first half, and also what you've just been describing, and we do seem to have a kind of a divide as to how people are responding. So there's the kind of the looking for hope, but there's also perhaps exploring a certain degree of complexity or deeper complexity in our characters. And, you know, we are presented in the political arena with a number of failed leaders. I'm going to put it from that point of view. We've been presented on the world stage with some very simple stories. I'm going to take on board Cheryl's observation. You know, the plural of anecdote is not data, but there is this sense that we see these various stories. It's like so countries that had a leadership that responded factually rather than emotively, responded quickly. The interesting statistic that if you are living in a country whose premier is a woman, then you are more likely to be living in a country with a lower death rate, and things like that. So we've seen a number of interesting things play out, and there's an experience of media there that I think is interesting, because that's something that we don't often get in our fiction. I'm not saying that it's absent, but the representation of the influence of media on our characters and on the world around them. It's often very, very background. Occasionally somebody will make an explicit point and include it, but it seems that most of what we are experiencing on a day-to-day basis is mediated quite literally by media. And that is something that perhaps would help us world build and character build more effectively in future. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or examples and counterexamples, because obviously there are undoubtedly both. Derek.
I'd take a quick stab at I mean, the representation of the influence of media. I mean, you know, I get worried about, I know around Quebec City and in some places in Alberta, we have the sort of start of right-wing media, the way it's portrayed in, you know, the United States, as we've seen for many years. And those are alarming things, because we think, oh, it's not going to happen here. And at the same time, that influence of media, that sort of anti-intellectualism, you know, until the 2016 election in the United States, I had thought, like many people, that there's a certain amount of progress that's happening and that we're getting slightly better every year and so on. And I think one of the things about 2016 that was shocking was there was one part of progress in one sort of bubble, and there was another part of, and like different kind of progress in a different kind of bubble, and the bubbles don't talk to each other. And I think that if we were to try and get into talking about that, I think the level of skill and complexity the writer would need to do to be able to hold different kinds of unreliable narrators and having characters who are responding to confirmation bias all the time. I can't imagine, like, I don't have the skill set as a writer to try and show that when I go on Facebook, it gives me this kind of message and I agree with it and I click, and then, you know, and it's just one more drop in the bucket of making me more like I already am. And so I think, yeah, I don't think we've come even close to understanding, even a specialist, much less as a general society, the power of confirmation bias and the power of media to feed that.
I think it's the ability to write that is, and as you say, I think it is that, and that's part of the reason that the question is posed. Is I think it's very hard because a lot of 2016 onwards doesn't make an awful lot of sense if we don't represent that. You know, that in other words, if you bring that into the narrative, oh, now I see some of the forces, the general tidal swellings that build this up. But the way that we often tell stories in novels and short stories often doesn't support that kind of sense of confirmation bias. It's as if it's almost a sort of deus ex machina in reverse. If we were to just sort of throw it into a story, it might look a little bit contrived, and the kind of story that would get rejected. People aren't like this. Well, actually, how do we represent that?
Cory Doctorow's new book, Radicalized, actually is 4 novellas, and one of them is literally a story about a guy being radicalized to become an armed militant in the United States. And, you know, because that's the central theme of it, and it shows it in his point of view, and we can watch his changing, that's I think an effective portrayal. But yeah, I don't think that takes away the point that, boy, it's hard to do.
It's hard, yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
I think it's oh, sorry, go on, Cheryl.
Yeah, I think we need to remember that this isn't new. Back when Ronald Reagan got elected, people were suddenly, oh my goodness, they've elected an actor rather than a politician to be US president. What's going to happen as a result of that? And I think if I were going to be tackling anything contemporary, I would want to go back and read The Space Merchants by Poland Kornbluth, Buckjack Baron by Norman Spinrad, and The Sheep Look Up by John Brunner. And see what they were saying about this idea that suddenly we would all be manipulated by the media and stuff. Because I mean, the history is cyclical, so we need to learn from it.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah. This is not new. This is not new, but perhaps the voice we need to go and look back and say, well, actually, this was there, but perhaps the level was a bit lower with 1 or 2 authors here and there. But yeah,
And find out why we didn't learn from it.
Indeed, yes. John Brunner, I would definitely say is, it was good of you to bring him up, because I think he was should be read more, and now is the time to be doing that.
Sorry, Adrian.
That's all right. It actually was similar to what I was going to nod to, which was that actually the history thing's quite interesting, because it might be a sad fact that this period doesn't really produce much interesting fiction, but in terms of the pandemic. But in the future, there could be some quite interesting books retrospectively looking back at this period, especially with regards to the media and how that's made everything play out. I'm just thinking of alternate history books written 50 years in the future about what might have happened if things had been different. But yeah, history is cyclical, but it's only ever really makes sense when you look back on it. So it might be too much information at the moment to really get a good handle on what's going on. And yeah, almost impossible to write a completely accurate portrayal of it.
I'm wondering whether the feel of the way things are around the media and the government might be the main thing that does come into fiction in the future. Because what I've been wondering since all this started is how anyone writing something that is contemporary, so not something that's set in another world or set in the future or set in an alternate history, is going to deal with something like the pandemic, because not mentioning it at all I think will be very, very strange. I think there has to be a nod to the fact that once all this is over, if it is ever over, once we have established a new normal, what that world will look like and how much it will owe to the pandemic. So you couldn't really write, a very straightforward contemporary narrative about boy meets girl or girl meets girl or boy meets boy without referencing the fact that this is the society we're living in, that we're now writing post-viral society rather than pre-viral society. And I think we talked about this a little bit in the first event, that 9/11 is one of the sort of the reference points particularly in visual formats, so film, TV. If you see the Twin Towers on the screen, it's pre 9/11, obviously. And if you see the skyline as it is now, it's post 9/11. And I'm just wondering how we're going to do that in fiction without going, and then of course we had the pandemic and the world changed. And I'm wondering whether it is going to be a lot of looking at the political situation, like looking at how we view the media, how we view our communities, whether you can do it that way without ever having to reference the pandemic directly. I think that
yeah. What will be the equivalent of the Twin Towers and the skyline? Yeah.
I'm not sure that will happen though. If you look back at the big flu pandemic in 1918, 100 years ago, it's barely referenced in any contemporary literature. People talk about the First World War and then they talk about the Roaring Twenties, but there's hardly any mention of it at all. And I think as well, the media and the ruling parties in this world, their interest will be to get the narrative back to normal as quick as possible. So this will be, like a giant Grenfell. It's a tragedy, but we're just going to move on and not talk about it and just get back to normal, get back to work, get back to earning money, get back to buying things, get the economy going again. So I think there will be a huge kind of official narrative to kind of sweep this under the carpet.
And actually, to pick up on what Cheryl was saying before, is that there's a particular gameplay that particular parties are pursuing. They have an agenda, and it is in their interest, perhaps not in our interest, but it is in their interest to get back to that narrative so they can continue their program. So for some people, actually, the pandemic offers an appropriate pause. So are we interested in, continuing that and keeping that alive? It's the Grenfell parallel is quite an interesting one.
Yeah. What if they reopen the economy and nobody shows up?
I'm trying to remember whether back in the 1980s anybody wrote any science fiction along the lines of what if AIDS was much more infectious and now hit the entire population. I'm sort of racking my brains. I can't remember anything, but maybe the hive mind out there will have some ideas.
Yeah, if anybody has any thoughts, because that's a really good point, because at the time, I don't remember it having a huge influence on the fiction that I was reading, but that might be just the reflections of an adolescent at that point.
I vaguely recall a vampire series that was like a sort of a metaphor for the AIDS crisis, but I can't.
That rings a faint bell, but I can't think what it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Check out
But
China Mountain Zhang by Maureen McHugh, because I know that's it was an early novel praised for having a gay character in it, so there might be something in that one.
I suppose the issue of how much we will have to deal with this current situation in future fiction or not really depends how long this goes on and to what extent we do return to a normal that we recognise from before. So if this goes on for quite a long time and we have mini lockdowns, further outbreaks, and it takes a long time for us to get back to being able to just brush past people in the street without thinking twice about it, it would be difficult to see how it wouldn't affect contemporary fiction. I mean, I spent 16 years as a criminal solicitor in and out of police stations. I tend not to read much crime fiction, but realistic representations of police station arrests process involves quite a lot of close proximity between people. Would that jar if you had a television adaptation of a crime procedural where the suspect is being patted down and he's leaning on the counter in the custody desk right next to the police officers and being handed a cup of tea? Are we going to be going, oh no, that they're not following procedure? What's going on? 2 meter rule, 2 meter rule.
It depends on how much society changes, right? I mean, if we have effective vaccination and effective treatment in 3 to 5 years, there's a whole lot of the forces that have been pushed into play that stop being drivers. But I think, if this goes on for longer, I think we will see the trend towards urbanization start to pull away, because all of a sudden, there were reasons why we were urbanizing. There were better jobs in the cities, there are more culture in the cities and so on. And, nobody wanted to do, like even in government where I work, the interest in doing Zoom meetings or whatever, video conference meetings, was not very large. And now all of a sudden it's you must do it that way. So the thing is, now that we've proven that it's entirely possible to do this and get 80 to 90% functionality out of video conferencing, there's a whole lot of people who can say, well, why do I have to live in Toronto? Or why do I have to live, have the house prices of New York? I've heard some people say, publishing in New York has always had this sort of truism that it has to be there because you have to be in New York to do publishing. But obviously that's all nonsense if everybody's in their apartments just video conferencing with one another. So the thing is, if you can move to a place where you have an acre of land and you enjoy it and you don't get sick because, it's much easier to social distance and it's far, far cheaper, the world could look different, because that trend of urbanization was like for 2 centuries. And now if it reverses, that'll be then I think we'll see the shock of the 2 meters. But I mean, if we end up having vaccines and stuff in the real short term, maybe we will be back to people just cheek by jowl in the subways. I work on the 18th floor, and every morning everybody waits in front of this bank of 6 elevators, and then the elevators fill up, elbow by elbow, and then we all go up. And by normal social distancing rules now, you can fit 2 people in the elevator, in which case, how can I even get to my office? So there's all that too.
I think there's some interesting consequences there, that some of those are very, very much around a tipping point, that it doesn't take much to change. So perhaps if we do get an effective vaccine within a few years, that situation may be recreated, but by then a lot of people will have already made choices to move out, and that will be just enough to depopulate, change the nature of work. A lot of things that were geographically assumed, we have it here in the UK. There's this idea that the City of London will somehow magically continue to retain its trading status and high status in terms of financial interactions after Brexit. And now we're seeing it's like, well, actually, economically it wouldn't, but why do we need geography anyway? These banks are still functioning. And it turns out that there's a whole load of jobs that do not need location presence. And all it takes is a few drops in percentage to change the overall direction. Sometimes it's just the smallest change. And I think that's the interesting one to explore. Perhaps I don't expect London to empty out in a few years, but I do expect the jobs and that move to the country that you're talking about could genuinely be a real force.
The knockoff consequences could be, if you have people from the cities who move to the country. Right now, we've been observing in Canada and the US, for example, that the big political divide seems to be reorganizing itself along urban versus non-urban. And if you have a bunch of people moving from urban areas to non-urban areas, that's going to change the voting patterns. It's going to change where hospitals are. It's going to change local policies. There's a whole bunch of impacts that come if you suddenly have virtual job locations and de-urbanization.
So that's an interesting one from a fiction point of view, because in science fiction we often have the representation of the great cities, and often it is more likely that a character will have come from a nowhere and gone to a city, by definition a somewhere in this context, than somebody having gone from a city to a nowhere, which is kind of so are we going to see a reversal of that there's a real push that we are going to end up with geographically independent stories?
I think we, in a sort of local sense, our village, I've noticed, I mean, we've got WhatsApp group and people are supporting each other through this, but our village has kind of turned quite inwards recently. So, we don't have a pub, we don't have a shop, we're a tiny little village, 35 houses, I think, thereabouts. And because it's a very odd layout, we don't see each other out on the street. There's no pavements, the houses are quite spread out. I've never really had that much of a sense of us as a community. And I think a lot of that's because we've all been looking outwards. We've all had jobs, we've been ferrying kids around. There's no school in our village, so we take our kids off to different schools elsewhere. There's very little public transport. And now everyone's sort of started turning looking inwards into the community, and we discovered actually quite a lot of stuff that we didn't know about each other. But I think we've rediscovered that sense of a small local community, which, I mean, that was being discussed in the first half to a great extent. So I mean, that might well be something that comes through in fiction in the future, that people are writing about smaller communities, smaller societies, smaller events perhaps.
But are we
Yeah,
really
in a
going to be?
place like?
Oh, go ahead, Adrian. Sorry.
Sorry. I was just thinking about the idea of de-urbanization. I think that's probably quite a stretch to see that that's going to happen to any great extent, especially in a place like the UK. I've noticed someone on the chat panel there saying there's literally not enough space for people to live out there. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I don't know what the data is there. But in a place like London, which used to be just villages anyway, I mean, I've lived in London a few times in my life, and it's always felt like you're in a kind of a very highly populated village wherever you live. It could be that certain cities just revert to that. It just might mean that it's cheaper to live in the cities. You know, it's a bit less of a stretch to say that you can own a property in East Dulwich, for example. But as far as cities emptying out and sort of spreading to the countryside, I think that's a bit of a stretch. And I think actually one thing that I keep thinking about is, with a certain degree of terror, is when this does finally end, or we return to some sort of normality, the amount of advertising we're going to be subjected to, from corporations and people that want us to buy things again, is going to be quite terrifying, I think. And it could be that people want us to stay in those cities. So yeah, recognizing that point where people are trying to get us to do things again is going to be quite interesting.
There's a story to be, there's a tale to be told there. Right, okay, in which case I'm going to say that we have reached the I think we've reached the logical end of that discussion, and there's some very good observations here. Jeff Park made an observation about whether it's COVID or climate change, our ideas about cities will have to change, and I think that is a really interesting one to explore. And I'm going to suggest that we close out the panel, we get everybody back, and give Anne control back to do the outro. We're going to go into a breakout session in a minute, but I'll let Anne describe the mechanics of that. This is the bit where we socialize. If this were a con, you'd be at the bar and you'd be grabbing yourself a drink, probably something a little stronger than this. You'd be grabbing yourself a drink, and
this is neat gin, so
Think for cocktail hour tonight.
Excellent.
4:30 to 5:30 East Coast time. We're going to be okay. Be there.
And
dress up.
And also, if each of the some of the panelists have already put their details up. I saw Cheryl already put up the 125 link and the free short story link. But if any of the other panelists would like to put stuff up there about where people can find your books or your social media presence, please go ahead. And I will hand back to Anne.
Thank you, everybody, for a very interesting discussion. We're going to move over to the other link that you've all had. I'm just going to reiterate what I've said to the panelists. I would like the attendees, as soon as this meeting ends, to click on the second link, because what I'm going to try and do is auto allocate you to the breakout rooms. If the panelists can wait 1 minute before joining that link, that means I should have cleared the decks, and then I'll have just the panelists on screen to start allocating them one to a room. So I'm going to wrap this meeting up. So thank you very much to everyone, and I will see you on the other side of the Zoom link. Okay, bye.